Hi, welcome back to Testive Advisor. I'm Ben. I hope that you've had a good time keeping up with your work this past week, that you've been able to get all of your problems done each day, and that you also finished the problems of the week and watched the lesson last week. If you've had any trouble with any of that, I'd consider an upgrade to Testive Coaching to help you out with some additional motivation and one-on-one support. Today we're going to be talking about the paired passage format that you'll see on the SAT reading section. This is a particular type of reading passage that requires some special skills in terms of understanding the passage and making the most efficient use of your time in answering the questions. As I said, today we're going to be talking about paired passages. So let's start by talking about an overall strategy that you can use to tackle every paired passage that you see on the test. As you get better at approaching paired passages, you might switch the steps that we're going to give you here up a little bit, but let's start off where you're trying your best to stick to these steps to a T as you go through the test, because it should really help you be more efficient. So the first thing that you're going to do is preview the questions before you actually read the passage. Now, you're not reading through every question in detail. You're just getting a really rough preview so that you can annotate them and help you with efficiency for the rest of the passage. So the first thing that you're going to do is label the questions, and then you're going to answer them in a specific order. So as you go through the questions, your job is to identify which passage each question is about. And then these next 3 points that you see here about labeling the questions are very straightforward. Label the questions about passage 1 with a 1, about passage 2 with a 2, and questions about both passages with a B. This whole process should take about 60 seconds, even to go through like a whole set of 10 questions. It should be pretty fast just to figure out what they're about. And it's not like this is extra time. You'd have to do that no matter what. We're just moving it up front to give you a little more efficiency as you read. The next thing that you're going to do is read the passages and answer relevant questions. So you're not just reading the passage straight through and then answering all the questions. You labeled the questions for a reason. You're going to read the first passage out of the pair and then answer the questions marked 1. So the questions that are just about that passage, you shouldn't have to worry about the second passage at all when you're answering those. You should just be able to answer them right after reading passage 1. Then do the same thing for passage 2. Read the passage and then answer the questions marked 2. Finally, now you've read both passages, now you can answer the remaining questions. You can answer all the questions that you marked with a B. That might require going back to the passages a little bit, but it should be more efficient than doing them all in one lump and kind of jumping back and forth between 1 and 2, 1 and 2, and both. Okay, so let's go over this question, and I'm going to assume that you've done a couple things at this point. That you've already gone through the steps of labeling the questions as applying to either passage 1, passage 2, or both passages, and that you have, at this point, read through all of passage 1. In fact, I'm really assuming you've done all of this because it was in your assignment, but I'm not going to go over those steps. I'm just going to assume that we've already covered those. Okay, so here's our first question that applies to passage 1. It says right here, the author of passage 1 indicates that Peter was successful because of, and then we have a few different options here, his genius and the force of his will, the suitable climate of his kingdom, the sophistication of his country, his flawlessness in everything he did. Now, when I see a question where it's a more general question about an author's viewpoint, I don't know exactly where to look in the passage for the correct answer, so my best approach is probably to start eliminating some things one by one. So let's just work from the end backwards. His flawlessness in everything he did. So why was Peter successful? Well, I know that from reading this passage that the author believes that Peter was successful, Peter the Great was successful, but not that he was perfect. As I scan through the first paragraph, I can actually see that it says that though he had faults, they never obscured his noble qualities. So that's basically saying, and it says he was liable to errors. So certainly not flawless. So we can eliminate that. The sophistication of his country. Well, his success was actually partly in sophisticating his country. We know from reading this passage. It says that he forced nature and his subjects and himself to render her, referring to the land and so on, to be more pleasing and noble. The arts are something he transplanted into countries. So the country itself was not sophisticated, so we can eliminate that. The suitable climate of his kingdom. Well, we know from the very last bit that we read in the passage, this last paragraph, that the climate of the kingdom wasn't so great. It says, if a man assisted only by his own genius has been capable of doing such great things in the frozen climes of ancient Scythia. Okay, frozen climes are not suitable. So we're going to go ahead and rule that one out, which leaves us with option 1, his genius and the force of his will. Well, we know that this is the correct answer after ruling the other 3 out. We also know from what we just read, if a man assisted only by his own genius could do such great things, and from the other answers that we read where it says he in every way forced nature and his subjects and himself by sea and land, etc., etc., that seems like a pretty strong-willed person. So the first answer choice is going to be the correct one. As usual, let's start by reading the question. The author of passage 1 indicates that the role of the historians is to. Okay, so I'm not going to read my answer choices yet. The first thing that I'm going to do is try to think, and surprise, surprise, I won't be able to really remember. I'm going to have to do a little scanning. Try to think about where this piece of information was in the passage, because it doesn't point us to a line. There aren't a bunch of paragraphs in this particular passage, so I can't necessarily remember exactly where it was. So I'm going to need to scan through for what I would imagine I'm going to be able to find the keyword historians, or something to do with history or historians. So let's kind of scan through here. I'm really just looking for that word, history, historians, maybe scholars or academics, something like that. Okay. As I come to the top of the, it was an easy to find place. As I come to this third paragraph, I see that it says, let the historians of that nation, let's see here. What nation? I did have history here, so I'm going to jump back. The civil, political, and military, government, trade, manufacturers, the arts, and the sciences have all been carried on according to his plan, and by an event not to be paralleled in history, we have seen 4 women successfully ascend the throne after him, who have maintained in full vigor all the great designs he accomplished and have completed those which he'd begun. Let the historians of that nation enter into the minutest circumstances of the new creation, the wars and undertakings of Peter the Great. Let them rouse the emulation of their countrymen by celebrating those heroes who assisted this monarch in his labors in the field and in the cabinet. Okay, so I'm going to break that down and kind of paraphrase it for myself. It's saying the historians of a great nation, let them, so that's kind of saying they should, enter into the minutest circumstances of the new creation. Well, I know that minutest basically means detailed or small. So the minutest circumstances of the new creation, I assume we're talking about the nation or the country. So we're saying that the historians should be kind of taking notes about the details of this new nation, about the wars and undertakings of Peter the Great. They should be getting people excited to emulate their leader by celebrating successful heroes on the battlefield and in politics. So it's kind of saying what the role of historians is, which is what our question is about. So let's finish this and then go over to our answer choices. It is sufficient for a stranger, a disinterested admirer of merit, so someone who's interested in, learning about good things, to have endeavored to set to view that great man, who learned of Charles the 12th to conquer him, who twice quitted his dominions in order to govern them the better, who worked with his own hands in almost all the useful and necessary arts, to set an example of instruction to his people, and who was the founder and the father of his empire. So I think we're primarily going to be concerned with the first part of this paragraph here. So let's see if we can find what we need over here. Write a detailed and difficult history for other historians. The role of historians is to write a detailed and difficult history for other historians. Well, that already seems a little bit, that seems like a little bit of a judgment on detailed and difficult history. Well, it seems strange that historians, we don't see anything here about historians writing for other historians. It seems like they're actually writing for their countrymen right here, and nothing about the need to write a difficult history. So I'm going to eliminate that. Occupy themselves with Peter the Great. Okay, that seems good so far. So the stranger, we heard about the stranger, can worry about the more minute details. That doesn't seem so good because we actually read that the historian should be concerned with the minutest circumstances of the new creation. Learn about the minutest of circumstances and smallest of players so that the stranger can first worry about larger figures. Okay. So now it's kind of making more sense where it says that the stranger, it is sufficient for a stranger to have endeavored to set to view that great man. That's a pretty tough sentence, but when we put it together with what we know about the role of the historian, which is to worry about details, it seems like this is probably going to be our best answer choice. Let's go ahead and take a look at our last one just to check. Extract theories from the past and transform them in a way that is relevant for all. I think that is probably the role of a historian in the real world in some way, but there's nothing about the author of this passage indicating that that's what they need to do. So you can't actually choose that answer because it's not grounded in the text. So we're going to go ahead and choose answer choice 3. Okay, so now we're into a question that is attached to passage 2. The author of passage 2 indicates that Peter the Great differs from other monarchs who have earned the title the Great because. Okay, so this is another one of these questions where we're going to need to try to remember where we found this in the passage, or we're going to need to scan through the passage to look for some kind of a key word. Thankfully, we have something that's pretty easy to identify if we're scanning through. We have the Great in quotation marks, which should be pretty easy to find. That's the kind of thing, proper nouns or quotations are keywords that stick out pretty well from a passage. So let's just scan through and see if we can find that. I'm going to jump ahead to where I would find it, which is right here in line 55, 56. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of that sentence here on line 52. He differs from other great military monarchs that have appeared from time to time in the world's history, and by their exploits have secured for themselves the title of the Great. Okay, so it seems like we're going to get everything we need out of this part of the passage because we're supposed to figure out how Peter the Great differs from other monarchs who have earned the title the Great. So basically, I already have a topic sentence for that. In this, that, while they acquired their renown by conquests gained over foreign nations, which in most cases, after the death of their conquerors, lapsed again into their original condition, leaving no permanent results behind. Okay, so it's saying the other leaders gained conquest over foreign nations, but then after they died, the nations were kind of no better off, or they went back to the way they were. The triumphs which Peter achieved were the beginning, of a process of internal improvement and reform, which is now, after the lapse of a century and a half since he commenced it, still going on. Okay, so that would mean that at the time this was written, after 150 years after Peter the Great had been kind of doing his thing, they're saying the changes that he set in motion are still taking place. So we've done a pretty good job of paraphrasing this. We're not going to need to do the single, eliminate a bunch of answer choices here because we have everything we need within the context of this paragraph. Unlike in some other questions where you have, a general author's viewpoint and you need to figure out which one of these fits it. Here we know that we've already kind of figured out the answer for ourselves before even looking at the answer choices. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of jump right ahead and say I'm pretty sure it's going to be answer choice 4. His accomplishments were more permanent. That's basically what we just read. We can really quickly rule out he was of greater physical size. That's kind of ridiculous. And then we can also rule out the first two because it was saying that the other because we know that it's answer 4, basically, right? We can rule these out because answer 4 is just clearly a much better answer. We don't even really have to have a reason that these aren't as good. We know that he was a shrewd military leader, but it's comparing him to other military leaders. We know he had conquest, but it's comparing him to other leaders who had conquests. So answer choice 4 is the right answer.
The following question asks us to compare the positions of the author of one passage with the positions of the author of another. Let's go ahead and read the question to figure out specifically what's going on. The author of passage 1 would most likely respond to the description of Peter's qualities in lines 66 or 68 by claiming that. So the first thing we want to do is read line 66 or 68 in order to figure out specifically what the author of passage 1 will be evaluating. Let's go ahead and do that. Notwithstanding the stern severity of Peter's character, so there's something negative about Peter, but notwithstanding that, the terrible violence of his passions and the sort of savage grandeur which marked all his great determinations and plans, and all his great positive things have this negative character to them, there was a certain vein of playfulness. So notwithstanding the negative, there seems to be something positive here, and they're telling us that that positive thing is playfulness running through his mind. And when he was in a jocose, again, this means playful as well, or merry humor, no one could be more jocose and merry than he. So it seems to be saying that even though there's negative things going on with him, there's an overall positive quality to him, and that's that he was very playful. Strange position. Let's go ahead and recall here what the author of passage 1 was saying. It looks like we're introducing Peter the Great. You've already read this, but as somebody that everybody looks to as an important figure. Think about how the author of passage 1 would characterize Peter. Would he agree or disagree with how author 2 describes him in line 66 or 68 of passage 2? Author 2 describes him as often harsh and severe, but also able to be merry and joyous. Now let's go ahead and look back in passage 1 for any direct evidence. The most helpful part of passage 1 for answering this is found in lines 8 through 12. If we go ahead and start over here with all Europe. All Europe knows that though he was fond of fame, so he liked fame, that he coveted it only for noble principles. So because of only here, it looks like we have some negative this time again, but after the comma here, we're introducing another positive, noble qualities, even though he liked fame. That though he had faults, they never obscured his noble qualities. So there's negative things about him, but overall, he's a positive character. So how would the author of passage 1 respond to this? There's negative parts about who this character is, but there's positive parts about who he is as well. He's a playful person. Peter was a bad person, but that doesn't undermine his achievements. Well, being jocose, being merry, isn't necessarily an achievement, and we're going too far saying that he's a bad person. That's taking it a little bit too far, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that answer. Peter's faults were outweighed by his noble qualities. Well, this seems a little bit better. We're saying over here that there are some faults. Being fond of fame seems to be a negative thing, since then that's followed by him coveting fame only for noble principles, which is a positive thing. And we're saying that those negative things aren't obscured by his noble qualities, so that makes a lot more sense. Let's see if we find something better. Peter was not a good leader because of these flaws. That is not something that's mentioned. The author doesn't believe Peter's faults were that severe or should be weighed to such an extent. At the end of the passage, he still clearly believes that Peter is a leader who should be emulated. And for this last one here, although these qualities were necessary in Russia, they should be avoided. Although the author of passage 1 admits the particular difficulties of accomplishing what Peter accomplished in the frozen climes of ancient Scythia, which is in Russia, this doesn't factor into a discussion of Peter's faults at all. So we can get rid of that one as well. And that leaves us with answer choice B as the correct answer choice.
Okay, so last question, but we've saved the most difficult question for last. This question is asking about which point regarding Peter's legacy is implicit in passage 2 and explicit in passage 1. Explicit means that it's specifically going to be stated in the passage. Implicit means it's not going to be directly stated, but it can be reasonably inferred from a line or the passage overall. So This means that we should start with trying to find the point about Peter's legacy in passage 1, because since it's going to be explicit, it's going to be easy to find, or easier to find at least. So here I've pulled for us the second to last paragraph of passage 1 that begins, "Let the historians," and this is an urging for historians to write about Peter's legacy, especially in the minute details, which the normal person wouldn't have the energy to look up, in order to get future generations to emulate Peter, because they think that Peter is a great figure that deserves to be emulated. So now that we know what's being said here, we could go and read passage 2 and try to find the point that's implicit. But this is going to be pretty difficult to do. And also, since this is going to be a question that we're answering after the questions that deal only with passage 1 or only with passage 2, we should have a pretty good handle on these passages by now. So the best strategy at this point would be to actually look at the answer choices and see what you can rule out. So passage 1 explicitly states that Peter's ruling in Russia makes him just as applicable, if not more applicable, to the rest of the world. And furthermore, passage 2 says nothing that would disqualify Peter's accomplishments from being relevant outside of Russia. So there's no way we can say that his legacy is relevant only in Russia. Moving on to the second answer choice, his legacy was quickly forgotten after he died. Well, these two authors are both writing about Peter years after his death. The author of passage 2 talks about the permanence of Peter's work and says that that was one of the reasons that he was so important. Usually when you're talking about historians, they're not going to think that dead people are quickly forgotten or should be quickly forgotten. Let's rule this out. And answer choice 3, this says his character faults are what we need to learn the most from. So both authors only briefly mention Peter's faults. They are something, moreover, that are outweighed by his virtues and accomplishments and can be almost brushed over. So for this to suggest that his faults are the most important part of his legacy, well, that's a bit silly and not really what is said in the passages. Don't fall into the trap here of thinking that a cliche you've heard and sounds pretty reasonable is the correct answer when there's no support for it in the passage. Okay, so now we move on to this last point, or last answer choice rather. Aspects of his leadership are still relevant today. And this is going to be our best choice. The author of passage 2 is writing about the death of Peter, and what can be said about his legacy as a whole. He is writing a history of Peter the Great so that his example can be remembered. And this is very, very similar to the author of passage 1's urging of historians to write so that Peter the Great can be remembered. And this is why we're going to go ahead and select answer choice 4 as our final answer. In this video, we discussed some strategies for approaching paired passages on the new SAT and walked you through some problems using these strategies. We hope that you now find these seemingly intimidating types of questions more manageable.
Reading the passages and answering the questions in the manner we suggested can really make a difference.
Happy prepping!